Webinar on student resiliency and really how to support the mental health and wellness of your student. My name is Anna Marie Tejas, and I serve as the Director for Parent and Family Programs at the University of Arizona. And again, thank you for joining us for this important conversation. We can move to the next slide, please. So while you're settling in, I thought I would share some registration highlights about our participants today. Our participants span across our nation, and we have a total of 14 states being represented. So we're thrilled to welcome all of you this afternoon. Each of you have been muted and your cameras are turned off. But if you hover your mouse towards the bottom of your screen, just look for that Q&A button. We are going to try to answer all of your questions. We've received many questions during the registration process, and Dr. Athey has reviewed them, and she's going to try to answer as many as she can this afternoon. If we don't get to those answers, we will follow up with you via email. This is an interactive session, so I encourage you to ask questions, and at the end of the presentation, we'll conduct a quick poll on topics for future webinars. And the next slide, please. So without further ado, I'm honored and grateful to introduce our guest presenter and my colleague. Dr. Amy Athey is an Associate Vice Provost and Chief Wellness Officer for the University of Arizona. She is a licensed psychologist and has led wellness initiatives in 2 previous campus roles at the University of Arizona. Dr. Athey is a national expert in building out non-traditional mental health and wellness programs for students and responding to critical incidents. She has published research on crisis intervention and responding, offering mental health and wellness services at ground zero after 9/11, Virginia Tech, and Hurricane Katrina. She is a national leader on sleep and mental health and serves on the NCAA Sleep and Wellness Task Force. Dr. Athey, thanks for being with us this afternoon. The virtual mic is yours.
Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be able to join you all today and share back on a topic that is frankly near and dear to all of our hearts. A little about me besides on the professional side. I am a mom of 2 teenagers. And so I share that to acknowledge that if only we could separate the personal and the professional. So today I'll share back a lot of information that comes from my professional experience, whether that's formal training or practical experience responding and supporting communities going through critical incidents. But also certainly I would be remiss if I wasn't calling upon my personal experience as a parent during this incredible stressful time. And the abrupt shift to remote work and homeschooling, and then the blurred boundary that came with all of a sudden even more so work was in our home or school was in our home, and these stressful demands had an impact both on the individual, on families, and certainly at larger communities such as at our institution. So I'm really grateful to be able to collaborate with Parent Family Programs and offer some resources for you all today. So why does this all matter? I also, a bit about my background is I'm a sport and performance psychologist, and I built a lot of the non-traditional mental health and wellness programs in the context of elite performance. And traveling from the ACC to the Pac-12, landed in the SEC in between that, what we know is that one cannot perform if they are not well. Whether that is in your role as a student, trying to pass exams, pursue your educational, your educational path, or in your role as an employee, performing to respond to customer demands, responding to your boss's demands, or in your role as a loved one, maybe in your role as a partner, a spouse, a mother, father, a daughter, a son. In each one of these roles, if we are not well, it is very difficult to perform and to meet what is needed given all of those contexts. So this is the foundation in my mind for our students of understanding that if they are going to persist and reach their educational and career goals, wellness is a core foundation for that to happen. So today our focus is on resilience. And I like to defer when we think about resilience to a definition garnered by my mentor, Dr. George Everly, who is an international expert on trauma, disaster psychology, and crisis intervention. Dr. Everly is one of the few psychologists in the world who helped respond to the previous pandemics, including H1N1, Ebola, and SARS. He was a consultant as we build our response here at the University of Arizona. And he's an expert coming out of Johns Hopkins that talks a lot about resilience being psychological body armor. And we're talking about this ability to bounce back, to pick ourselves up again and try again until you are able to succeed or perhaps find a more productive path to pursue. And there are some key factors that really kind of compose that body armor, if you will. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we can use those today. And specifically, I want to talk about active optimism, decisive action, a moral compass, having tenacity, and that interpersonal support and the roles that they play. These factors combined really help people withstand that adversity, knowing that that psychological body armor helps shape a form of immunity, if you will. We know that those who engage in behaviors to strengthen that armor help themselves to be able to make solid decisions when under pressure. It can help with motivation, help us persist despite the challenges or kind of being beaten around a little bit by life. When we are knocked down, it does help people kind of recover and get back up. And overall, we know that these factors contribute to people's report of overall happiness or life satisfaction. So broken down a little bit more specifically, here are 4 of those components. In just a moment, I'll take a small dive into each one of them. Active optimism. You hear a lot about people framing this. Are you a glass half full or glass empty kind of person? The reality is this is a dynamic condition, and certainly we have our lens, and our lens are essentially cognitive habits by which we see the world. We make sense of the world and the things that are happening around us, as well as to us in our interactions back in that engagement. Active optimism is not just painting a rosy picture. Oh, it'll all work out, right? No, it's active. And so what we refer to this is really specific behaviors which people use to be able to shift that lens from just hoping it works out, or the negative, like, oh, this whole place is burning down, to some action steps or how we can kind of evolve and actively look forward. Specific to that, you can consider is how you make sense of the observations around you, specifically around perspective taking. So in every situation, actually, our perspectives are very limited, if you will, by the habits that we have used to make sense of previous life experiences. And so I always encourage people, if you could kind of just take a step back and kind of be a fly on the wall, if you will, or, even today, maybe zoom in on your nanny cam and watch yourself. What might you be missing? Perspective and considering this helps when we are talking to others who may be able to hear and see things through their lens. Be aware that emotion is contagious, however. So if their lens is clouded by a lot of negativity and their own despair or negative emotion, that is a social contagion. So just be aware of that. But it can help you by bouncing ideas off of others. A second piece about active optimism comes back to also strategies around how you can engage in a growth mindset. And what I mean by that is every day we are given through our life experiences, whether it be an email, a quick text, even an in-person engagement, we are given back a ton of data. And oftentimes our perspective and how we use that data shapes then our consequent actions. So if we make sense of the data given to us as just that, data to inform us of what to do next. And we ask the powerful question of, what can I learn from this? It can be more empowering rather than disempowering, because really then we are taking control of then perhaps the next step or how we're dealing with those situations. So what can I learn from this today? Having a very balanced approach can be very helpful with that. I'll jump over to decisive action for a moment. We know in times of crisis, when it comes certainly to leadership and how people communicate, decisive action is incredibly critical. And so when we think of decision-making frameworks, there's a ton out there. You can research and kind of take a look at some different ways to make decisions. But I often encourage people just to have a basic, simple framework. Like, what are the pros and cons that could result from engaging in this action? And what are the pros and cons that come from not engaging in the action? And perhaps it kind of just that matrix alone will illustrate a path that may not feel as grounded before you engaged in that exercise. Decisive action is also influenced by a number of things. The halo effect, it's kind of how people perceive you. And self-fulfilling prophecy refers to the impact of those self-beliefs on our actions. So we know for those who engage in a situation and have the self-belief that they are able to successfully complete a task. So I'm scheduled to present to you today. The self-belief is that whatever this dialogue brings, I will be able to respond and share back something that will be helpful. Just having that belief that I can be effective in this moment does influence my effectiveness in this moment. It'll influence both how I present as well as what I'm presenting. And then certainly any halo effect would be perhaps reflective maybe on what your expectations of our conversation would be. So thank you for the wonderful introduction, but certainly my background, my experience brings a certain expectation of the information that you'll receive today. So the interaction of my belief in myself impacts my ability to perform, which interacts with your expectations of what I can deliver. So it's a very dynamic process, but it really comes back to, and when we're thinking about how we can help our students, how we can support their own self-beliefs, that they can bounce back. And despite what life brings at them, they can learn from it and respond in a way that will help them grow, persist, and achieve their goals. Moral compass, real quick, psychological body armor. We would be remiss if we weren't acknowledging that our values help to ground us. And despite life's challenges, when we make decisions that are congruent with our values, it may not always be easy. What the experience though tends to be is that the path forward becomes just a little lighter because people are not struggling with a disconnection between their actions and their values. So I encourage people to self-reflect during this time. And for many of us during the pandemic, it has been a catalyst for self-reflection. In challenging times, oftentimes people come back and ask the question, what is most important right now? I know there have been many of Zooms that I've had to jump off and assist my children in their learning, or just trying to keep them together, given the stress that they were having in the abrupt transition to learning from home. It is challenging because I don't want to disappoint certainly my colleagues or those that I'm working with. But despite the distress that comes from knowing that I perhaps disappointed my colleagues, I am able to weather that a little bit better, knowing that my decision was congruent with the values that I hold and the prioritization of those values in supporting my children. Lastly, a comment about interpersonal support. If you leave here with one thing, it is that we know that the most powerful predictor of resilience is the social connection, the interpersonal support. And this is beyond being able to send a text, a phone call, a FaceTime, a Snap, an IG DM. This is meaningful connection. And one of the challenges that has come with the evolution of social media, but even in now our remote work and educational setting environments, is that we are more connected, arguably, than any other time in history, and yet also more disconnected. And what I mean by this is that oftentimes the connections may not be incredibly meaningful. It may not hold the depth of emotion that can bring about that social emotional connection that really helps build our body armor and be able to bounce back during these challenging times. So for those of you who may have younger adolescents, and certainly those of you with University of Arizona students in that period of adolescence, it's very common, if you ask that closed-ended question, how was school today? You're going to get fine, good, right? I even get it in text message. It was good. I just get good. And so consider how you could shift your questions, and asking open-ended questions. It's not going to guarantee you'll get more, but by asking open-ended questions, you are inviting in someone else to share back a little bit more. So considering, what was the best part of your day? What were you proud of today? Or what was something funny that happened at school today? But asking open-ended questions, getting away from those yes/no questions, can be more inviting of that meaningful connection. Okay, moving on. I've mentioned the pandemic and responding to crisis, and so I feel I would be remiss if I was not sharing back with you a little bit about what we have learned from previous critical incidents in our history, and how we have responded, how people as individuals responded, as well as communities. My hope is that it will provide a context of understanding perhaps what you may be seeing with your students, and also specifically some strategies, tools, and resources to support you as you are supporting them. This is a graphic that initially comes from Myers and Zunin's work, but I pulled this from SAMHSA's website. And I'm sharing this because it's really important in understanding the impact of people's response to disasters. This was pulled from highlighting a community's response or individuals' response to a number of different types of critical incidents. But I think it's relevant given our time, and certainly this past year. When a critical incident occurs, it's really one that can be very overwhelming of your individual ability to respond to those demands, and a number of different, it has a number of different impacts. But there's also a process or a phase that people kind of can go through in the response. First, when it first hits, people they do amazing things to get through. Oftentimes, you will have a very heroic kind of response in these early stages. And despite maybe feeling fearful, they're able to kind of push through it. Then there can become a honeymoon phase where people made it through, and despite feeling inflicted by various aspects of that quote unquote damage, there's this gratitude that comes over them. Well, we saw this after 9/11, when people were grateful to be alive, were just glad to push through it. And I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide about kind of things to be aware of during this time. Notice though there is a cascade, and typically the impact of a critical incident can lead to a disillusionment phase where people may experience emotional reactions such as anger or rage, sadness, or grief. They may feel really fatigued or discouraged, or even just really overwhelmed by the stress. Note in time, people recover, and that's kind of like the graph emerging back up. And there's another number of different triggering events that can kind of disrupt this recovery: anniversaries, other disasters occurring. But that's the general kind of path through this. A couple of considerations here. Many may argue when we consider the pandemic, we're past the heroic phase. I don't think it's necessarily linear. I think you can have people kind of bounce in and out of these stages. Um, but certainly last spring, when we had an abrupt transition due to the pandemic, people were running on adrenaline. I mean, it was phenomenal to see my colleagues and what they were pulling off at the last moment, students responding to a lot of uncertainty. When you ask people how they're doing, some would say they're fine or just powering through. And it's important to note that may be their truth in that moment. It could also be a false negative. And they just may not share that they are being impacted. So honeymoon could also be a false negative, like, oh, thank God it's over, we made it. Denial can be very powerful during this time. So just to kind of keep on your radar. And disillusionment is usually when we see the bottom falling out. Glad we survived, but glad I was able to make the transition to remote learning, but, fill it in with whatever the struggle may be. That graphic I shared with you really kind of considered the impact of one discrete incident, a Hurricane Katrina, for example, coming through, and then a community recovering. Unfortunately, during this time, it is not clear cut. And I mentioned Dr. Everly earlier. He refers to pandemics as arguably the most psychologically toxic of conditions. And there's 4 main reasons why he mentions as such. And these graphics somewhat illustrate that. First, the severity. I saw CDC release that this year, COVID it was the 3rd leading cause of death for Americans. It has been far reaching and impactful in terms of financial securities, with families losing incomes, houses, food security. So the severity here is quite significant. The duration of pandemic and our hourglass here graphic, it's not discrete. It feels like it just keeps going. And certainly I've done some work with our healthcare worker and first responder communities. And, people were talking about burnout, honestly, frankly, in some of those communities before the pandemic, certainly in the spring. And we're beyond, I think we're coming up on the 4th wave. The prolonged duration of the pandemic can induce even more psychological distress. And the response to that, the recovery to that mental health wise goes far beyond even the physical health element. I am estimating that we are looking at a protracted recovery when it comes to mental health and wellness with regards to the impact of the pandemic. And if we base what we know of communities recovering from other critical incidents, one could easily argue that our mental health and wellness recovery from the pandemic could be 24 to 30 months. And I say that quite conservatively. So we're on a long road. Ambiguity from this pandemic, and I share the graphic there of the varying ways one could see that those wolves. It's hard to know, right? It isn't always a clearest cut path. And the uncertainty that comes induces even more distress. All of these factors can be buffered by factors of resilience. And for individuals, those aspects of psychological body armor can help buffer the impact of uncertain, ambiguous, protracted nature of this critical time, as well as the severe impact that we have all felt by it. Resilience factors come from leadership. And for you and your family units, I argue that many of you serve in leaders in those families. And by instilling hope, by providing support, and oftentimes being authentic in saying, I don't know. It can help buffer the impact of those other factors that lead it to be a very psychologically toxic condition. Just full disclosure, when last spring in 2020, when I was talking to my girls, I shared our family motto this year is roll with it. and whenever I heard, well, it's not supposed to be this way, being flexible can help buffer some of that. And we're just going to roll with it. We're going to, typically they know I have high expectations in their academic performance. My expectations were that adjusted to, they just need to turn everything in, and we're going to roll with it. So factors of resilience can help buffer the uncertainty, severe times, the protracted nature of this crisis, as well as the ambiguity that comes along with it. I also have some good news, however. If you look at the research around traumatic stress and the psychological impact of traumatic stress from a whole host of events, this is actually a slide taken from the NIH report. If you really try to take all that we have known from these varying horrific traumatic events, most people bounce back. Humans are naturally resilient. And this slide here illustrates that about a third have more mild reactions to stressful events. That could be maybe a night or two of having a hard time sleeping, or some worry, or feeling upset, just more on edge. About a third may experience more moderate reactions, where that anxiety or kind of being hyped up just kind of carries a bit longer, or you have more nights of not sleeping well as opposed to fewer. And then there are a third who may find themselves having more impaired, being more impaired by the severe reactions. And that third, we do recommend that they use professional treatment resources to help them facilitate recovery. The first 2/3, however, it's important to note, many of them bounce back by the use of their social networks or their own coping tools. And then another part of those groups extend that to other types of support resources. And we're going to share back with you in a moment what we have at the University of Arizona and our surrounding community to help. But again, it's important to note this because we are starting to become inundated. And I do hear national studies around college students having heightened depression and anxiety. About, one study I saw 20% more impacted than ever before. Yeah, we all do. And in many ways, those are normal reactions to abnormal events. Doesn't mean we're going crazy. It doesn't mean necessarily we even have a mental health disorder. What it means is our bodies are responding to help us survive and then thrive through these stressful times. So I mentioned those common stress reactions. I share here, this is taken from the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. They have a couple of resources, and we're going to share those back with you. These resources summarize common stress reactions. And it's important to note, because of that mind-body connection, we must take those physical stress reactions seriously. We understand that the impact of stress can cause significant chest pain, elevated blood pressure. So these can be medical emergencies. And so I do encourage you, if you notice these in yourself or your loved ones, these do require medical evaluation. It is not appropriate to say, oh, it's just in your head. It is because of that mind-body connection we see. Just a quick note, the mind-body connection is so significant. When I'm working with elite athletes and they're getting ready to perform, if they're feeling kind of flat, what sometimes we have them do is, there's a reason for that pump up music. So any music with 115 beats per minute or higher will increase your heart rate. You don't even have to be running around on the court. And so when you have the impact of stress, arousal, it's important to take those physical reactions very seriously. But those cognitive, emotional, behavioral stress reactions can also be equally discomforting and even get in the way of our abilities to kind of navigate our day and meet the responsibilities or demands upon us. For our students, it's important to understand that at times, given the stress, they may feel just kind of more distracted or having a hard time attending, making decisions. It impacts our ability to think creatively or have more flexible more flexible cognitive problem solving abilities. And there's also can be kind of a hypervigilance or like a sensitivity to like, oh, what's that? And so those are cognitive stress reactions. We could talk a minute about some tools to kind of cope with that. Emotionally, it's common for people under stress to feel depressed, overwhelmed, anxious. It is common just to be more on edge and kind of lose that emotional control. It's also that denial can creep in as well. And people are, that Edie Brickell song, I don't know if I'm dating myself, but I'm fine. You can kind of tell where it's seeping out of someone, they're not fine. You can sense that emotion and the impact of the stress. Behaviorally, I encourage you to pay attention to significant changes in people's behavior. So if you have somebody who usually is a social butterfly, but all of a sudden is incredibly withdrawn and persists in that withdrawal for some time, that's a sign of that impact of that stress. It is very common for our appetite changes to happen. So sometimes people under stress eat more, some people eat less. And it's also common in our culture at times for people to self-medicate with alcohol and drugs to be able to manage that stress. So again, common stress reactions to pay attention to. I want to share with you an important resource. In college students, we know that it can be common for students to have thoughts of death or even self-harm. And I share with this resource with you because it is the single most science-backed, widely adopted and utilized suicide prevention tool. This tool that comes from Columbia, the Lighthouse Project, has been adopted or endorsed by nationally and internationally, including the CDC, the NIH, the American Psychiatric Association, Psychological Association, in the DoD. The Marines, in an effort to respond to the significant increase in suicide they were having, they used this tool along with things like peer support and embedded counselors. And as a result, they had in 1 year a reduction of their suicide prevalence by 22%. This tool is very basic, and because it is so science-backed, also we want it to get it out there to everyone. So if you go to the website, what you'll find is this tool has 6 basic questions. And if you ever have a concern about loved one, all you have to do is ask these questions. And it also helps guide you then of what to do. Just first, to dispel any myths, no, asking the questions does not put the thought in someone's head. That is a myth. Oftentimes it's quite the opposite, where that if someone had been suffering in silence, by merely asking, you are providing such a support, gives them the space to be real. First off, you always ask first 2 questions. Number 1, have you wished you were dead or wish you could go to sleep and not wake up? And number 2, have you actually had any thoughts about killing yourself? For question 2, if they answered yes, and only if they answer yes, you ask 3 follow-up questions. Have you thought about how you might do it? Have you had any intention on acting on those thoughts? And have you started to work out the details of how you would do this? And do you intend to carry out that plan? If they answered no to question 2, you can just skip those 3 and go straight to question 6 and ask, have you done anything, started to do anything, or prepared to do anything to end your life? You always ask question 6. Given the response, the box on the bottom helps you to guide you on how best you can help your loved one. If someone answers yes to anything, I encourage you to reach out for professional support. It could be one of the institutional resources. So we have those kind of provided for you here in this talk in a minute. It could be your primary care provider. It could be a mental health professional in your community. However, if you have question 4, 5, and 6 is a yes, that high risk does indicate that you should seek immediate help. So you can take your loved one to the emergency room. There's there's specific numbers here that you can call 24/7 or text the suicide prevention hotline or lifeline, and they can help you in those moments. Um, the orange zone, the moderate, it doesn't require immediate, but it does reinforce that this person could benefit from speaking with a medical professional, behavioral health referral. So a great tool that's out there. We've been very grateful to partner with the Columbia Lighthouse Project. And again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to get that tool out there. So, okay, a couple other resources for you, a story for you. Let's see, Emery, I mentioned I was at Ground Zero on 9/11, which was earlier in my career. And a colleague of mine who went on to specialize in more of the corporate performance space, we met in grad school. And his name is Rob Fazio. I'm proud of him and his story in honoring their father, Rob Fazio Sr. On 9/11, Rob's dad, Rob Fazio Sr., was in Trade Tower 2. And like many that day after the first plane struck Tower 1, heard the intercom come over and announce, actually, just stay put, we're okay. Rob Fazio Sr. shared back, nope, everybody, we need to get out. He led his coworkers that day down the stairs and helping people get out of Trade Tower 2, and went back to hold the door so that his colleagues could all exit. Unfortunately, we lost him that day, holding the door so others could get out safely. And my friend and colleague went on to create holdthedoor.com. It's a nonprofit organization whose mission is to help people grow through loss and adversity. Phenomenal organization, and one of their models and tools, if you will, to help people through really challenging life events is this learn, laugh, and love. And I share this back with you today because sometimes, we're going through life and it just feels like the punches keep coming. But at the end of each day, if we can consider back what's one thing that we have learned, what's one thing that I want to go check out tomorrow, what's one way we can love and one way we can laugh. These are ways which can help build up that psychological body armor. So it can be dreaming about your future and what you love to do. It can be finding a new passion or purpose and sharing it with someone. It can honestly be sharing back that funny gif that just breaks the tension and spreads the laughter. So great resource here, Hold the Door, and I will share that out with you at the end with all of our other resources. But that tool really kind of comes back to how we're taking care of ourselves as we continue to go through these stressful times. And in helping our students, we share this information with them as well. We are all performers, as I mentioned earlier. And so the foundation of that is being able to take care of our bodies. We know sleep is critical, and yet under stress, it's often such a sensitive system, very disrupted. So finding ways we can use relaxation techniques, finding ways where we can establish routines in our schedule, getting out of bed if we haven't fallen asleep within 30 minutes. Other things include just proper nutrition and hydration. Being in the desert here, we all know how critical it is to drinking that water. Psychologically, that relaxation and connection or disconnection time. Contact with nature, we know, helps bolster that armor, but also creative expression. So I encourage students that if they're having a hard time verbally sharing what they may be experiencing, consider all different creative ways of expressing. Some of our are incredibly artistic and prefer to doodle, draw, sculpt, paint. Some of them, the use of music is phenomenal. To be able to to share back what they may be experiencing. Spiritually, we know a connection with a faith-based community or other spiritual practices can be very calming and helping to bolster that armor. And then I'll comment on the last two, professional and social interpersonal. Connection matters. It needs to be meaningful connection. And we encourage you to consider parents outside of work, our students, even connecting outside of those work and academic demands, and having that peer support. There's nothing like talking to somebody who's going through it with you. And so that is critical. On the professional side, academically or with work, finding ways to kind of having some separation along the way is really critically important. So some resources to support those coping tools, if you will. I mentioned most people get through stressful events without the need for medication or psychological treatment. With that being said, though, there are many ways that we can lend support across a continuum of care. In response to the pandemic stress, we developed Wildcats Rise, which stands for Resilience in Stressful Events. It's based on a psychological first aid model, which is not psychological treatment, but rather direct, compassionate support by trained peer leaders. We developed Wildcats Rise and have iterated it throughout the semester, fall semester, as we receive feedback from our students. And now we have on-demand offerings. So students can go to this website, and within the scheduled time, they can click and be placed into the interactive queue where they can connect with a peer trained in psychological first aid. We also have a couple of groups offered for undergrads and grad students. And it's critical that this service is offered at no cost. This is psychological first aid, is the standard of care in response to the large-scale mental health demands that come from critical incidents such as the pandemic. It's been recommended by CDC and NIH, American Red Cross and the United Nations, in addition to our mental health professional organizations. So we're really grateful to be able to put together this resource for our Arizona students. Additional on-campus resources, we have a plethora of institutional serving, health and wellness resources for our students. We have our counseling and psychological services office within our campus health system. We also have LifeWork Connections, which is important. While many of their services are for employee-facing employees, they do offer childcare resources for our students. So if you have a student who is a parent themselves and they're looking for additional support and resources, I would direct you there. And of course, our campus rec. You may have seen this handout. We are going to share back with you a link with these mental health services across our institution. This document really breaks down the types of services that are available for our students, as well as eligibility considerations, how to access that service, and if there's any fees associated with that service. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at wellness@arizona.edu. I also wanted to share with you a couple of reading assignments, right? If we're at an academic institution, I want to share with you some kind of further resources, just as you make sense of what you are seeing and how people are responding to these challenging times. I shared back Dr. George Everly's Psychology Today blog, Disasters of Uncertainty. That link here just kind of is a casual read that highlights the impact of psychologically toxic condition in this pandemic. And then my Psychology Today blog really focuses more on individual skills that we have learned from elite performers to help us weather these psychologically toxic conditions. So specifically, how do we navigate these stressful times and still perform well on that exam coming up or on that presentation that we have to give? And what have we learned from the skills by those who have had to perform under pressure when things are uncertain or dynamic or challenging? what skills have they used that we can use ourselves in these other roles? So 2 resources for you there. Nationally, I shared back some resources. But really today, our hope was not only to share all of this with you, but to be as engaged as we can in this space and answer specific questions for you. We do have a few that were pre-submitted. And so we'll work today. I'll rely on Cassandra helping me out with some of those questions, but also if you have thought of something just from our talk today and can enter it into the chat, I'll do my best on the fly to answer those as well. And if we miss any, we will surely send them back out to you after our talk today. All of this, as you know, is being recorded, and here's the contact information and our websites there on the slide. So with that, I will take a breath and turn it over to Cassandra, if you can help me by firing off some questions that people may have.
My pleasure. So I think we should start with some of the ones we received beforehand. So let me read one of those off right now. And this is timely. So it says, can you talk about strategies for managing change and anxiety around getting back into the classroom? As excited as my son is, he is also a bit unsure about the change.
Absolutely. You know, humans are creatures of habit. Actually, if you ask somebody what's something that you would do that would be most relaxing, oftentimes people say things that don't require them to change much. You know, like, I just want to lay on the beach. Well, there's not much change there. Like, literally, you're kind of just sitting and taking it all in. So change is challenging, and in the wake of stress, it is work. I'll be frank. What you're seeing now, and I am grateful for this, we're even seeing it with our staff, is with our phased reentry, we have the opportunity to phase the change. And unlike the impact of the abrupt shutdowns that we all experienced across our country in March, that were very rattling to us in our routines, we now have the ability to start phasing in routine change. And so one thing that can make change a little bit easier is to take it deliberately and slow, and build on each week. So knowing that we're going back to the classroom full time in the fall, we have the opportunity with some of our students returning to some of their classes now. Perhaps not all of them, perhaps not at the scale that we may anticipate for the fall, but we do have their opportunity to start engaging in those routines. For the fall, I would encourage them to consider other routines of where they are engaged in small groups, and still using those mitigation strategies to help remind themselves that while it may be a risk, it is a mitigated risk with those strategies. And then individuals can consider specific tools that they can use to really regulate their own response to that change. So if they are going back into the classroom, are they thinking through what that's going to be like? Think about any student who arrives on campus for the first time. Oftentimes it's helpful to get their schedule out and just walk through a day and identify where their classroom's at. Why? Because it goes from being unfamiliar to familiar. So let's not forget some of those resources that were there and that we can use now. So helping them know where it's at, helping them understand if they are in a bind or having challenges, who they can reach out to help navigate that challenge. And then individual strategies that maybe reduce their anxiety is how they're thinking about that change. One strategy that I often will ask people is this a challenge or is this a threat? Now, in many contexts, the perceived threat really wasn't real or rational. With the pandemic last March, this was real. This is very real. People have lost loved ones. As I mentioned, the severity of this is incredibly real. With the mitigation practices in place, including vaccines, include improvements in how we understand to treat should someone get COVID, mitigation strategies such as face covering, social distancing, physical distancing. One could also make the argument that now that reentry becomes more of a challenge than a threat. It is amazing that once we shift our perception as to what this activity is, neurophysiologically, we even have changes. Instead of stress hormones being released like cortisol, we have other engaging hormones like adrenaline or testosterone, but the cortisol is down. So it enables us to respond, but not perhaps with the detriment and detrimental impact of the stress hormones. So if you can shift your perception from a threat to a challenge mentality, that's an individual strategy that can actually help too, as they're re-entering an unfamiliar situation.
All right, Dr. Athey, let's answer some of the questions live just to make sure we get to some of those as well. So one of the questions says, how often do you communicate this information and resources to students?
It's a great question. So Health and Wellness Initiatives has a number of different programs. We have Wildcats Rise that I shared with you, that certainly those peer support members are in the community sharing back. We also have another program called our Life Management Counseling and Consulting Service. And this was a new initiative that came out of the 2018 strategic plan in an effort to further support the health and wellness needs of our students and their goals towards graduation. These counselors are also trained in mental health first aid and partnered with Cassandra, provide back mental health first aid training for our faculty, staff, and students. And those embedded counselors serve in a number of our colleges as well as our student support units. So the question about how often do we share back, I could pull the numbers, but I would say incredibly frequently. And we have done programs such as this for our graduate college, for a number of the faculty, staff, and students in other colleges and student support units. So whether that's in Thrive or the A Center as well. So we are trying to disseminate it as much as we can. And although we're always looking for partnerships to get it out there as well.
So this question's about fall. Will you consider a workshop in the early weeks of fall semester for those students who need help with reentry, much like freshman orientation, et cetera?
Absolutely. A number of my colleagues and I, we've talked about how we can facilitate the recovery, and that reentry is part of this. After any stressful events, getting back into routines is a core component, and I think we want to consider routines, and part of that is this outreach that we can offer and extend to our students as they are navigating the reentry. So yes, between health and wellness initiatives, other institutional serving units such as CAPS, but even some of our embedded units at SALT, athletics, international student services, we are all partnering to consider how we can get the information and the word out to the students.
So we got a lot of questions about how, as parents, they can be talking to their students about mental health. And you kind of referenced this about the open-ended questions, but maybe you can speak to that a little bit more. This question in particular says, how much involvement should the parent of a college student have in helping their child make healthy choices?
That's a great question. It's certainly something that we've talked about with many of our campus partners. In full disclosure, even in preparation for this webinar, our prep team, kind of we got into this a little bit. I encourage you to consider two aspects of our current situation. One, what we know about normal development of our college age students, specifically 18 to 25 is what I'm referring to. This is a time that traditionally was incredibly dynamic and possibly stressful for families as their students were transitioning into more of an independent adult role. You know, certainly they're learning, but also it impacts the whole family system as they are also adjusting to that role. So it was common, for example, in the fall, before students went home for fall break, that students would come to counselors, and some of the conversations were about how are they going to navigate going back to their home environments after being independent and making some of those choices, but now living in their family's home. And how are they going to have those conversations and reestablish those boundaries, right, of being back in the home. So normal development is a period, this is a period of individuation. So we want our students to be developing their own decision-making abilities, right? Because ultimately the goal is to launch them into being contributing members of our community. With that being said, we also know that guidance and support is critical. So one resource that I often share, both personally and professionally, I don't know how many of you are aware of Love and Logic, and it is a parenting, it's often a parenting model that is shared back in educational K-12 systems. They do a lot of training with teachers in educational systems. But one of the things that was a takeaway for me when I was first exposed to their model and materials was the idea of that parent role. And are you a consultant? Are you a drill sergeant? You know, are you the helicopter who's swooping in? And that consultant role really resonated for me, frankly. And so how involved do you get? You can kind of think of those different roles. And so asking questions that are open-ended and asking, you know, how would you like some ideas about what I've noticed from other people solving similar problems, right? First get their buy-in before, you know, drilling in there with the advice giving, or you should do this, or sending an email to somebody for your student. So considering ways you can align and partner with them and opening that conversation up. The other piece of this is this about mental health. This isn't just like a one-time conversation. We know this about sexual health as well, right? Like this is a dynamic conversation. It's ongoing. It's not just one conversation. And some core components that can be helpful is with mental health is being real and not scaring them, but providing them some security. Like, wow, like this stress has really gotten to me. I'm gonna turn off the phone. I'm gonna go for a walk a little bit, and modeling some of what we want them to do. And so that can be really helpful. I mentioned the normal development, and then I also shared with you today the slides on what we know that can happen in stress reactions. So in normal development, we want them exploring, thinking really flexibly, and it can kind of be scattered under stress. However, we know that you can become cognitively inflexible. So one thing to keep in consideration as you're talking about mental health, and even if you have concerns for your student, is that if somebody is highly stressed, they are not going to be able to cognitively come up with a lot of ideas. In that regard, you can empower them to still make the choice for themselves, but you may consider giving them 2 to 3 choices. So you may say something like, well, you know, a couple things you could consider would be 1, 2, 3, or just 2. Because cognitively, much more than that, it's going to be really difficult for them during that stressful time. Yet the decision they are making the decision of what they want to use to help take care of themselves during that time. So those are a couple resources. It is very, the more we can kind of just be open in the conversation about, you know, how has the stress impact you? Like, sometimes people don't realize it till they're kind of out of it and look back, but because this has been such a protracted time, it may be like looking back to last spring, like, wow, yeah, that was how I was, and maybe asking them, how is it now for you?
Perfect. So there is a question about specifically, what are the warning signs to watch for that might indicate a serious problem? And I think this is an important one to address.
Sure. A significant behavior change is always where I first start. So as parents, we know our children. And so I mentioned earlier when we were talking about stress reactions, where you see behaviors all of a sudden that just seem very different. So they were social, very social. Now they won't come out of their room. Maybe it's the opposite, right? Maybe they used to kind of be more kind of homebodies, and now they won't ever come home, or they just are always bouncing around. Any one of those signs and symptoms in and of itself may not, feeling overwhelmed, normal reaction to an abnormal event. It's usually the combination of them all. If you certainly are seeing cognitively people presenting as incredibly disoriented, so if your students just seem really out of it, if they may seem out of touch with reality, where stress may be impacting where they are seeing or hearing things, those types of significant mental health, please reach out. Our CAPS, our Campus and Psychological Services Office, their number you can contact even after hours. I mentioned those physical signs and symptoms, but the other piece I'll mention is the behaviorally is really around the substance use and abuse. It is common in this population for us to see self-medication happening. And so just kind of keeping an eye out for the persistent pattern of substance use. And then at the same time, if you see perhaps maybe their grades are dropping off, they're disengaging with typical friends or family, and these other interactions kind of being impaired possibly by that use. So that's, those are like the big things. If at any time you're not sure if someone is having thoughts of self-harm or suicide, please pull out that Columbia. It gives you the questions to ask and the direction of where to go. You don't even have to worry about, remembering them. But ask if you're at all concerned or wondering if they're having thoughts.
So something else that this is kind of a summary statement, but if parents feel like maybe their students are more shut down and they are having trouble with opening those lines of communication, we talked a little bit about asking those suicide questions, but what about how do you just get them to open up, or what do you recommend if you're not in contact with them as frequently as maybe you used to be?
For sure. So, well, I'll start if you do have contacts. So, one of the things that we sometimes note, and I think we may have gotten a question about this that somebody submitted early on, where when our children were little, we could lay in bed and maybe read them a book to fall asleep, and then all of a sudden they would start sharing. I had a psychologist, a colleague of mine, who shared that every once in a while, even as a high school student, she would just like lay next to her son right before bed and just talk about the day. And there wasn't eye contact as much because they were both laying there looking at the ceiling, but it could happen. Likewise, sometimes driving in the car, right? Like obviously you've got a captive audience, they're not going anywhere, but not having that eye contact, it can kind of be blended into conversation. It may not feel as that you're interrogating them, if you will. For those of you who may be parenting from a distance, obviously that's more challenging if they're not there for you to go on a car ride with. And so one of the things I have found is, first off, sometimes you have to balance the open and the closed. So you might ask, what's been going well for you lately? And see if they give you something. Then you may have to come back to a closed question. So who have you been hanging out with, right? Usually there's gonna be like one, maybe a couple answers, or have you been hanging out with anyone? That's a definite closed question. So, and get them to give you something. And then you can kind of go back and pull back to the open-ended questions. Sometimes with adolescents, it is hard because even despite our best efforts to ask those open-ended questions, they can be challenging with the fines, goods, nothing response. Another piece of it is you sharing back. So sharing back, perhaps things going on in the family, with friends, being able to kind of just start the conversation with something that may feel less threatening than them putting them on the spot to ask them about what they're going through or doing or experiencing.
Great insights. Anna Marie, did you have any others that you saw, or if there's anyone else here that has more questions, we have a few more minutes with Dr. Athey.
I didn't. I was reading through the questions and it looks like you covered most of them. I know there were some other questions that we will answer and follow up via email. But a great conversation. I'll wait a few minutes to see if any others pop into the Q&A. I really liked your comment on balance. I think it is a balancing act that us as parents are trying to really do, especially this last year. In the beginning of the year, we're really promoting independence and allowing your students to take charge of that journey. But it's a different conversation when you're needing to check in with them and make sure that they're doing well. So a lot of great links and tips, and I just thank you for your time and your insight and the resources.
Yeah, for sure. It is. If only we had a parenting manual, right? You know, if only there was that way of doing it. And it is my hope that I can share some resources, and I share with everyone, even when I was consulting with elite performers. I have this expertise in performance, but you're the expert on you. And it is really you kind of using some of these tools and kind of crafting your own toolbox to be able to navigate these things. And with parents, even with in the family, right? Like my oldest is now of the age who tells me like her youngest sister gets to do everything that she doesn't get to do. And that's not the case, right? Like you parent us differently. And well, yeah, because, your younger sister is a different person and needs different things. And so even your toolbox sometimes if you have more than one child ends up looking different. And it's just based on what that person needs to guide them.
Well, some big takeaways. I like the psychological body armor. I think I'll continue to use that. But as you mentioned, we have resources. So the first link is to the Parent and Family Programs website where this webinar will live, the recording will live. So guests can continue to refer back to it and just link back to those various websites that you mentioned and a lot of the resources that you discussed. The second bullet point is the email address to Parent and Family Programs. If you have any additional questions, please send them our way and we will make sure to get them to the appropriate resources. If they apply to this conversation, we'll forward them to you, Dr. Athey, and Cassandra, and then anything else we'll answer ourselves. And then a great resource, wellbeing.arizona.edu. I went through that link carefully, and there are so many resources to counseling services, the Students Rise. So make sure you open that link and view all of the resources available to your student. With that being said, oh, it looks like another question popped in. I see you nodding. Okay, so I'm going to read this to you. How can you get your son or daughter to reach out and talk with someone when they are stressed to tell you they have anxiety with the situation and you suggest there are people to talk with, but they say, I don't need to talk. Things just need to change. How can you convince them that it's helpful?
So a couple of things to consider there. It sounds as if one element of that is that person wanting the world or the events around them to change. And we know that possibly that could happen. And then also we know that because it's an interaction between our choices and some of those events, we have influence over them. So considering, asking kind of that magic question, like, well, if things were different, what would it look like for you? If, you're talking about things will change, well, what would that look like? And then a follow-up to that is, okay, if that change happens, what do you think you're doing now that can help that You may not have full control, right? We don't have full control over everything, but oftentimes we do influence that outcome. So getting them to kind of start thinking a bit. The reality is that that process can be hard, and a lot of times people do seek out that help. So when you wanted, one thing as a student, like if a student wanted to go to college, my guess is to make that change, they reached out for help to do that. They reached out to perhaps a family member to support them as they pursued application process. They reached out perhaps to admissions professionals at institutions to learn about the process, make decisions of where they were applying, and execute that application. And then even the acceptance of offers and enrollment. Oftentimes, to make that change, which it is a change to go from not being a student to being an enrolled student, that change happened because likely perhaps they reached out for some guidance in course selection and enrollment in their fall spring semester. So normalizing what does change look like and what our role is in our life changes can be helpful. And having anxiety with the change of returning to classes or a different kind of educational challenge right now, that's another change that we're going through. And so what are some of those resources you can reach out to? One of them being mental health. And there's a whole different, people receive mental health and wellness support in a lot of different ways. For some people, it may be in their faith community. It may be a peer. And so we have Wildcats Rise, but have you talked to any of your friends ever about this? And maybe another trusted loved one, an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, a grandparent that they feel connection to, that you can start there and seeing. If you feel like they need professional, and one way is actually helping to connect them with, well, how about let's just make a call and see if you can get an appointment. Now, at being that most of our students are legal adults, you're not going to be able to call and make people appointments. But what you can do is just say, hey, like, how about let's make this appointment together? I have sat with students when they called to make that psychiatry evaluation appointment. I didn't, I shared my office phone and they were on speakerphone, but helped get them that appointment. I've walked students to advisor office, a nutritionist office, different offices. So you can, again, in that advocacy, support, and consultative role, kind of guide them and be there for them if they have any questions. But ultimately, those appointments, they go in and they're able to talk themselves. The last piece about this is mental health, and the awareness and acceptance of that is still, I would say, in early stages. We've made a lot of headway in destigmatizing mental health, but for many, we still have a lot to overcome. And I think one of the impacts of that stigma is if somebody goes and meets with a counselor and doesn't feel a connection or doesn't get out of it what they were hoping for, oftentimes you're like, oh, that didn't work, I'm not going back. Well, what I say to somebody is, if you go and get a bad haircut, do you ever come back and say, I'm never getting my haircut again? Probably not. I guess, like for many of us, it's a little longer this year than normal, but usually people will just go to get another haircut and try a different stylist or barber. So that is, I think, one thing also is to help share back with them what they could expect if they did reach out for professional support. It could be sharing back your own personal experience with mental health therapy treatment. It could be just being aware that when you call, the first meeting is really an opportunity for you to share what's going on and for the therapist to share how they may best help you, their approach to helping you, and for you to both determine if it's a good fit. And, usually I encourage people to give a couple of sessions before they make that final call. But really that's kind of educating them on the process and what it looks like. It helps to demystify it a little bit. So.
It's great advice. I think everyone needed to hear that. Before I do anything else, I wanted to quickly launch a poll just gauging our attendees on future topics. This is something that our office would like to continue offering to our parents and family members. So our answers are coming in. That's great information. While our guests are answering this, I just wanted to say thank you to you, Dr. Athey, Cassandra, my colleagues who are helping us answer and host this event. It was a great collaboration, and I think there are so many resources that our parents and family members can take away to continue to support our students. Any final thoughts?
Thank you, and know we are here, to support you. If there's questions that you kind of wake up and you're like, oh, I should have asked that, shoot us an email, and we want to be a resource for you and connecting you and your students to support services to help them meet their goals.